1933. The United States has been sinking for 4 years. GDP has fallen by a third. Industrial production by half. 1 in 4 workers has no job. Banks are closing in chains. And nobody knows how to stop the fall. Franklin Roosevelt reaches the presidency and does something no government had attempted at that scale: spend. Spend massively. Roads, bridges, dams, schools, parks, public jobs. The New Deal put millions of people to work with government money. Did it work? That depends on whom you ask. And that argument, 80 years later, is still unresolved. Today we are talking about the government's second great lever, fiscal policy. In the previous episode we saw how central banks move the money lever with interest rates and quantitative easing. But there is another lever. One that is not controlled by central banks but by elected governments. One that is decided in parliaments, debated in election campaigns, and generates more controversy than almost any other economic topic. It is fiscal policy: how much a government collects in taxes, how much it spends, and what happens when it spends more than it collects. All fiscal policy boils down to 2 columns. On one side, revenues, what the government collects through taxes on income, consumption, corporations, inheritance, and dozens of other sources. On the other side, expenditures, defense, education, healthcare, infrastructure, pensions, interest on the debt. When revenues exceed expenditures, there is a surplus. When expenditures exceed revenues, there is a deficit. And when the government needs to cover that deficit, it borrows. It issues public debt, bonds purchased by banks, investment funds, other governments, and sometimes the central bank itself. The accumulated debt from all those deficits is the national debt. And its size is usually measured as a percentage of GDP, because what matters is not how much you owe in absolute terms, but how much you owe relative to what you produce. So far, accounting. The interesting part begins when we ask, does public spending stimulate the economy or hold it back? John Maynard Keynes proposed in the 1930s an idea that revolutionized economic policy. When the government spends €1, that euro does not disappear. The worker who receives it spends it at a shop. The shopkeeper spends it on a supplier. The supplier pays their employees. And so on. Each euro of public spending generates more than €1 of economic activity. This is called the multiplier effect. If the multiplier is greater than 1, it means public spending generates more wealth than it consumes. If it is 1, it breaks even. If it is less than 1, public spending is less efficient than leaving the money in private hands. How much is the multiplier in practice? That is the million-dollar question. And the answer depends on context. Empirical research shows that during deep recessions, when there is high unemployment and unused productive capacity, the multiplier tends to be high, around 1.3 or even more. When the economy is near full employment, the multiplier falls, sometimes below 1. The logic is clear. In a recession, public spending mobilizes resources that would otherwise be idle: unemployed workers, shuttered factories, idle capital. But when the economy is already running at full capacity, public spending competes with the private sector for the same resources. And that is where the most important criticism comes in. Classical and monetarist economists have a powerful argument against expansive public spending. They call it the crowding out effect. It works like this. When the government borrows massively to finance its spending, it competes in the credit market with businesses and households. That increased demand for credit pushes interest rates up. And higher rates make private investment more expensive. Result: public spending displaces private spending. The government grows at the expense of the productive sector. Keynesians acknowledge the effect, but add nuance. They say that during a recession, when private investment has collapsed, there is nothing to displace. The government occupies a space that nobody else wants to occupy. And in a liquidity trap, when rates are already at zero, the crowding out effect simply does not occur. Who is right? Both, depending on the moment. The empirical evidence suggests that the fiscal multiplier is significantly larger during recessions than during expansions. That is, public spending works best precisely when it is most needed. But it also confirms that during periods of full employment, the crowding out effect is real. The lesson is that context is everything. There is no universal answer about whether public spending is good or bad. It depends on when, how much, and on what. Let us return to Roosevelt. The New Deal of the 1930s was the first great experiment in public spending as a countercyclical tool. Between 1933 and 1939, federal spending went from 6% of GDP to nearly 11%. Roads, dams, airports, hospitals were built. Public employment programs were created. Social Security was established. The results were mixed, and it is important to be honest with the data. GDP growth was impressive between 1934 and 1937, with rates close to 10% per year. Real output returned to pre-depression levels by around 1936. But unemployment was still around 15% in 1939. The Depression did not truly end until the Second World War, when military spending pushed the economy to full capacity. Later research estimates that the New Deal multiplier was close to 1. That is, each dollar of federal spending generated approximately $1 of additional economic activity. It was not a miracle. But it was not a waste either. Millions of people had employment, income, and dignity in the worst years of the crisis. The debate remains open. Keynesians argue the New Deal did not fail, but was insufficient. Roosevelt should have spent more. Classical economists respond that it was precisely the massive government intervention that delayed the natural recovery of markets. The evidence does not close the discussion definitively. And that honesty is important. If the New Deal was a test of public spending, the euro crisis starting in 2010 was a test of the opposite, austerity. When the global financial crisis hit Europe, several peripheral countries found themselves with unsustainable deficits and debts. Greece was the most extreme case. Its deficit reached 15.8% of GDP in 2009. Its debt exceeded 130% of GDP. The response, driven by the Troika formed by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, was austerity, massive public spending cuts, tax increases, and structural reforms in exchange for bailout loans. The results were devastating. Greece's GDP fell 25% between 2009 and 2016. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%. Healthcare cuts led to increases in mental illness, suicides, and HIV infections. Poverty soared. And here is the cruelest paradox: despite all that austerity, public debt did not fall. It went from 130% of GDP in 2009 to 180% in 2014. By contracting the economy, the cuts reduced tax revenues faster than they reduced spending. The denominator of the debt-to-GDP ratio was sinking faster than the numerator. Spain, Portugal, and Ireland also implemented austerity programs, with less extreme but equally painful results. Millions of people emigrated. An entire generation postponed its entry into the labor market. Does this mean austerity never works? Not necessarily. Under normal conditions, consolidating public finances can restore investor confidence and lower borrowing costs. But applying harsh austerity in the middle of a deep recession, when the private sector is already contracting, is like pouring water on a drowning person. The 2020 pandemic broke all the rules. Within weeks, governments around the world approved spending packages of magnitudes only seen in world wars. In the United States alone, fiscal measures totaled more than $5 trillion. Direct checks to families. Expanded unemployment benefits. Loans to small businesses. Aid to local governments. The federal deficit reached 14.9% of GDP in 2020, the largest since the Second World War. The spending worked for its immediate purpose: it prevented an economic collapse. The pandemic recession was brief and the recovery swift. But it had a side effect many economists had warned about: inflation. The combination of massive fiscal stimulus with pandemic-related supply restrictions generated the largest inflationary wave in 40 years. This illustrates once again the fundamental tension of fiscal policy. Public spending can be enormously effective at stabilizing an economy in crisis. But it has consequences. There is no free lunch. Fiscal policy decisions seem abstract when discussed in terms of multipliers, deficits, and debt ratios. But behind every number there are people. Behind Greek austerity are families who lost their homes, pensioners who saw their incomes cut by 30%, young people with university degrees who emigrated because their country had no work for them. Behind New Deal spending are millions of people who were able to feed their families thanks to public employment that, according to purists, should never have existed. And behind post-pandemic inflation are working families whose purchasing power eroded because prices rose faster than their wages. Fiscal policy is not a theoretical exercise. It is the most concrete decision a government makes: whom it taxes and on whom it spends. And that decision, more than any other, defines what kind of society we want to be. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, fiscal policy has 2 main tools: taxes and public spending. When the government spends more than it collects, it generates a deficit financed by debt. The multiplier effect means each euro of spending can generate more than €1 of economic activity, but its size varies with context. Second, the great fiscal policy debate pits Keynesian stimulus against classical austerity. Evidence suggests public spending is most effective during deep recessions, when there are idle resources. During periods of full employment, the crowding out effect is real and the multiplier falls. Third, neither unlimited spending nor unqualified austerity works in all circumstances. Context matters. And the consequences of getting it wrong are always paid by the most vulnerable people. Monetary policy and fiscal policy are the two great levers. But governments also shape the economy in a third way, by setting the rules everyone else must follow. Regulation, antitrust, financial supervision. The rules of the game. That, next time.